I'm Mark Drummond, one of the founders of NeuralSense. NeuralSense is Africa's leading neuromarketing company. We conduct cutting-edge market research using biometrics and consumer neuroscience technologies to elevate customer experiences. We also provide consulting services to our clients. Today we're going to be talking about the application of neuromarketing for e-commerce to boost online sales. We'll be touching on some key concepts from our field, including attention, emotion, salience, and decision-making. My colleague, Dr. David Rosenstein, will be taking you through those concepts. I will be touching on some of the technologies that we use within our field, as well as their application for understanding online user experience from both a user interface and user experience perspective.
Consumers don't think how they feel. They don't say what they think, and they don't do what they say. Emotions drive consumers to act, think, and feel. So how do brands ensure they're connecting with consumers emotionally? Over 90% of our decisions are influenced by factors outside of conscious awareness. NeuralSense quantifies these emotional and cognitive aspects of the consumer experience. We enable brands to find better ways to ensure these experiences grab attention, drive emotional engagement, increase memorability, and ultimately influence behavioral intent. NeuralSense optimizes retail experiences, online user experiences, and product experiences, as well as advertising and marketing communications, store design and layout, and even product design. Using biometric technologies, NeuralSense provides insights that are unbiased and actionable by measuring consumers' implicit subconscious responses. This helps brands to truly understand what is going on in the hearts and minds of their consumers. Emote your brand with the science of neuromarketing. NeuralSense is the only full-service consumer neuroscience consultancy in Africa. We are leading experts in conducting cutting-edge scientific research in developing markets and informal trade economies. NeuralSense. Consumer insight, quantified.
Hi, I'm Dr. David Rosenstein. I'm one of the directors at NeuralSense. Neuromarketing is a subfield of market research, and it incorporates a lot of different disciplines. They include things like consumer psychology, cognitive science, and neuroscience. It also includes sometimes aspects of behavioral economics. It's a more scientific approach to market research. We move away from the traditional market research approaches, which rely on self-report.
Now, many of you will be familiar with more traditional market research methodologies, like qualitative and quantitative research. And although these are very useful in kind of understanding a consumer's claimed response to an experience, it doesn't really get to their underlying behavior as to why they behaved in that way. And often it's fraught with bias. There's two main biases that come into play when consumers self-report on their experience. The first one being a self-assessment bias, and that consumers are very bad at actually really understanding their emotional drivers and why they behave in certain ways. There's also self-reporting bias, in that they're influenced by the interviewer in the room or how the question has been phrased. And they'll often tweak or alter their response given the conditions that the question's been asked in. So now these two types of methodologies in traditional research, both qual and quant, really look at the conscious responses of a consumer, those conscious processes. They don't really tap into the unconscious processes, which actually determine around 90% of our daily behavior. David Ogilvy's got this amazing quote where he says, customers don't think how they feel, they don't say what they think, and they don't do what they say. So we can't really trust them, can we? But with neuromarketing and consumer neuroscience, we can actually get under the hood. We can measure their unconscious, subconscious response to an experience. And this gives us an understanding of the implicit way that they experience something and some of the motivational drivers that underpin that.
So unfortunately with self-report, people have a lot of biases. They also want to tell the interviewer, if you're doing a focus group, in a way what they want to hear. There's a lot of different self-report biases and effects that come in there. So we bypass that. We get underneath the individual's conscious, what they think they want you to hear, and we get into what we call implicit data or unconscious data. And those include things like heart rate, changes in the eye fixation, so where the eye is looking, that's eye tracking research. And we also do brain imaging and brain scanning research, which can include a very complex thing called electroencephalography, which is a measurement of the electrical conductivity on the surface of a person's scalp, which tells us what's happening deep down inside. These insights can seem quite complicated and like rocket science or neuroscience, but we make them very digestible. We give you the insights. So what are the rules of thumb and unconscious principles to help you make your marketing strategy more effective, or tell you what's going on in your customers. You can't ask people directly, like, how do you feel about something? Well, you can, but they may not tell you exactly, or they may not be able to tell you, put that into language. But we can tell you what that emotion is, what kind of emotion it is, whether they're annoyed, whether they're happy, and we can actually quantify it. We can put numbers to it. Yeah, we do a lot of this work in the e-commerce space. We do a lot of bot testing, website testing, UX work. We work with UX designers or agencies or clients themselves in optimizing their user experience process, often in iterative testing or one-off research studies.
Now, neuromarketing is really a field born out of some mad scientists who like to conduct experiments on willing users and consumers. Today I'm going to be taking you through some of the technologies that we use in our field, as well as touch on their application within e-commerce. Let's dive into some of the technologies that we have available to us. First up is electroencephalography, or EEG. These are devices that essentially measure a consumer's brainwaves, and we can compute cognitive brain state metrics such as engagement, cognitive workload, so how much mental effort is being applied to a task, and others that really help us understand both the emotional and cognitive processes that are taking place during a customer experience. They're relatively easy to set up, however you do get more advanced units that have much more electrodes. Essentially, electrodes are like a pixel, so the more electrodes we have on the head, the better idea or understanding we have of what's actually going on under the hood. We've also got access to near-infrared spectroscopy. These devices actually use LED lights to shine into your scalp and measure blood flow, and through that we can understand what kind of cognitive activity or mental processes are taking place in your prefrontal cortex. Functional magnetic resonance imaging looks at blood flow within a consumer's brain while they've been exposed to stimulus. Those areas of the brain that are activated at certain times receive high amounts of blood flow, so we can really understand mental processes at different moments in time. Facial coding software allows us to understand the emotional response of a consumer during an experience. We understand the 6 basic emotions of happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, and disgust, and we can look at these on a second-by-second basis. Eye tracking technologies enable us to understand levels of attention. We use mobile eye tracking glasses in a store environment to see how someone shops a shelf or navigates a store, what products they look at, does price play a role in promotional activity. We also have remote units that actually sit on a desktop or laptop or mobile device, and with these devices we can see exactly how someone physically navigates a web page, what grabs their attention, and how do they navigate to various areas of the site. VR or virtual reality headsets also have built-in eye tracking technologies, so we can test 3-dimensional spaces or environments, again trying to understand attention and focal areas within these environments. GSR, galvanic skin response, essentially measures the level of emotional arousal of an individual over time. These units are really useful for user experience to understand moments of frustration or heightened engagement. Facial electromyography are small devices that are actually applied to a person's face, and with these devices we actually measure muscle contraction to tell us what emotion is being felt at certain moments in time during that experience. Verbal analytics is software that picks up your intonations in your voice to understand what mood you're in. Implicit association testing is also used to understand people's implicit biases towards certain categories or concepts. During online UI and UX testing, we use eye tracking to see exactly how someone physically navigates the page, what's grabbing their attention, and what are they actually aware of. Do they look at your promotional activities, banners, displays, buttons, and how do they search and navigate certain product categories? At the same time, we're measuring all their biometric feedback. Facial coding allows us to understand their emotional response to an experience. Is it positive? Is it negative? Where they're getting frustrated or confused? And where are the actual moments of surprise and delight during the overall user experience and journey? GSR, galvanic skin response, gives us an indication of the extent to which they are emotionally engaged during that experience. This can also highlight pain points or moments where the user is getting highly frustrated or annoyed with a certain process or system on the site. Pupillometry, looking at the eye behaviors and how the pupil responds to the experience, also gives us an indication of cognitive load and engagement. So how much mental effort is actually being applied to the task at hand, and are they still actively engaged? Taking all these measures into account, we can really get a great understanding of both the emotional and cognitive experience of a user during their website user journey or mobile app experience. Before David touches on what exactly are emotions, I'd just like to elaborate on the importance of emotions, specifically for online user experiences. Now, for tangible products and services, it's very easy for a consumer to build an emotional connection with the brand. Take, for example, Apple. Now, if any of you have an Apple product, please just raise your hand if you still have the Apple packaging somewhere in your house, or home, or office. I'm pretty sure probably about 90% of you have raised your hands. Why is that the case? A lot of you will post-rationalize and say that, no, I'm keeping the packaging because I might need to take it back in a few months' time if the product's faulty. But I bet you there's some product packaging that's been in your cupboard for years on end, and it's just collecting dust. Now, one of the main reasons why you keep this packaging is because you've actually built an emotional connection with the packaging itself. So that whole unboxing experience has really been thought thoroughly through. Everything from the way that the cardboard sucks and the air moves through the products, the way it feels and the way it smells, it's all building on that emotional bond and connection. So it's very easy for brands to leverage these kind of sensory experiences to build an emotional bond or connection. When it comes to intangible goods or services, like most e-commerce sites are, it's very difficult for you to do that. Often you can only rely on visual stimuli, either through your website or web page, and if you're lucky you can bring in some audio components, but you can't touch or feel or smell your products or services. Fortunately, it's not all doom and gloom for intangible products and services. Rapid advances in technology allow you to actually create more customized, personalized experiences through the use of chatbots or other artificial intelligence or machine learning algorithms. Now, this can be really useful in creating not only your brand persona and engagement with a consumer, but really in terms of really driving that engagement on a one-on-one basis and personalizing their online user experience. An emotional connection is really important for driving engagement. And in e-commerce, that's what it's all about. It's about driving attention and engagement with your platform. David will speak a little bit more about attention and what it is and how it actually works. But from an engagement point of view, without emotional engagement, consumers are less likely to refer you to their friends and family, to come back and be repeat customers, or to kind of rave about you through word of mouth.
So what is emotion? We all have an intuitive understanding of it. It's the way I feel about something. But why do we have emotions? As psychologists, we take the view that emotions are motivational. They drive us towards the things we want, the things we enjoy, and they also help us make very quick decisions on things that are potentially bad for us or harmful, and move us away from those experiences. They also affect memory. So if something has an intensely strong positive emotional experience, we're more likely to remember it. Likewise, if it has a very intense negative emotional experience, you're going to remember it. And we need to remember it so that in a future situation, we can make a fast call, a fast decision. We call that a heuristic. So emotions help us make these heuristic decisions. We have 5 core emotions. And we're a bit pedantic, so we talk about feelings and emotions. So these 5 core emotions are anger, fear, disgust, sadness, and joy. It sounds like there's only one positive. And then you have a number of feelings which stem from these emotional states. So if you take joy, you may have like a high level of happiness, a sort of just a bit of a contentment. You could have ecstatic exuberation. So you have a varying degrees of intensity, and that's also where emotion becomes contextualized. So we have an emotional experience, and what's also really important is emotions are embodied. We know from neuroscience research they occur in a deeper part of the brain. So when I say deeper, it's more central, not cognitive. We often are aware of our emotions, we can think about them, but they're not purely cognitive in terms of we have thoughts and language which goes with it. It's embodied. But then with feelings, you put language, you put context to it, you make sense of the experience. With the customer journey, we need to understand emotions. It's something that's been lacking in traditional market research because you're assessing a cognitive response. You're asking a person to interpret their experience, to subjectively self-report. You don't necessarily get into that emotional space with them. If you ask someone if they like something or not, they're probably going to give you a very straightforward response. So you need to tap into that body, that deeper emotional level, to understand the drivers. Is this person moving towards the experience, the product, the brand, or they're moving away? Are they trying to get away from that experience? So emotion gives you a really good idea in neuroscience research, in consumer neuroscience research, whether someone is doing that. So an important thing to consider with emotion is something we call valence. So valence is a term we use to describe emotions that are positive and those that are negative. So the positive emotions will drive you towards, we call it appetite, towards having more of that experience. Negative emotions will get you away from something that's painful for you or unpleasant. In the e-commerce space, that happens very quickly. A person will land on a page, or they'll open their phone, and they'll have an immediate experience. They'll maybe see branding, and if there's frustration, what it may do is end the experience. They may not move further down the line. If you can facilitate a positive emotional experience, a positively valenced experience, it's likely to kind of carry them forward. There's a high correlation between a positive emotional state and motivation. So feeling like you want to get more of something. Positive emotion, it may be very intuitive, is also associated with sort of curiosity, interest, and you're going to kind of spend more time doing that. What I'll mention in a short while is something called the attention economy, and that's directly related to emotion. So if a person's not having a good experience, their resources of attention, how much time I actually want to spend doing something, is going to be less. They're going to spend less time spending those resources on that page, on looking at that brand or searching for that whatever they want to find on that particular website. So keep in mind that emotion and attention, which is what you're focusing on and thinking about at the time, are intrinsically linked. So attention relates to working memory. If we think of a brain, we can use a bit of a computer metaphor. We've got our hard drive, which is our long-term memory, where we store lots of information. We can't possibly store everything. Our brain just doesn't work like that. It doesn't take a picture of something. It stores information in bits and pieces, and then we draw it together. We call that encoding information, and then we decode it. And when we decode it, we have RAM. So if you think of your hard drive as your long-term memory and RAM as short-term memory, working memory. So when a computer's working, it draws things into working memory so that you can execute a program. You can use your Word program or watch videos, etc. And that's RAM. We have RAM, it's working memory, and that's related to attention. And the way attention works is we can only keep a limited amount of information there. Our brain is very efficient. It doesn't want to waste resources. So it'll only store what it needs to, and we use the word parse, which kind of get rid of irrelevant information. If you're in a shopping center and you're going to get what you get, your groceries every month, you don't want to think too much about that experience. You kind of have an idea of what you want. You don't want to expend a lot of energy. Our brain uses a lot of energy as glucose and oxygen and things like that. It's going to work in a heuristic way. That's where emotions come in and attention. So you're going to go and find the products you want, load your trolley, get home and watch the Netflix you've been looking forward to watching, or chatting with the family and getting out of the shop as soon as you can, because it's exhausting for you. We actually quite bombarded. We, at this point in our, I suppose, global society, where we have this veritable sort of access to information whenever we want, almost any information online. And as well as that, when we look at marketing, we're bombarded with marketing information from all sorts of places, whether that's online, email, YouTube, watching videos, other forms of social media. When you're in a store as well, point of sale material, there's a tremendous amount, and it's impossible to actually take all of that in. So you will pass, P-A-R-S-E, you'll pass, you'll eliminate what's unnecessary. So if you've seen something that's important and it may drive you towards what you're looking for, it's useful. But if it's just clutter, it's going to be ignored and very unlikely to be remembered. So what happens is it has to go into attention, working memory first. You attend to something, and then you'll encode it if it's relevant. And emotions can make things relevant if it's personally relevant to you, if it's novel. There's a number of criteria, principles we look at which determine whether something's potentially going to move from attention, you attend to it, working memory, into long-term memory. We, again, quite pedantic being psychologists, we discriminate between perception and attention. So they're very, very similar, and also sensations. The first thing that happens is you sense something in your environment. You use your senses, hearing, seeing, or tasting, smelling if you can. If you're online, it's seeing primarily, then hearing things. And I think we neglect hearing, but you hear something. You direct your attention and you perceive it. Perception means you've now put it into your attention. So you're directing resources there, cognitive and emotional resources. And the interesting thing is people don't do that for very long. It's a number of seconds. It's why you have 5-6 second, well, not the only reason on YouTube, it's because people press skip. But it's why people don't consume 15-minute YouTube videos in information. It's why people want short bites of information. If there's too much information, it's not just that you're extending the attention resource, because it can anyway only take in so much. It's that people don't want to, it's resource intensive to encode, attention to encoding. But when it comes to consumer behavior, that's even more the case, because consumer behavior has a strong reward aspect to it. So the person wants to get what they want quickly, efficiently, be rewarded for that. I feel good, I've got my purchase. And that scales up and down depending on value, depending on a number of contextual criteria, what the product is, what the brand is, etc. But if you strain that person, they're not going to put those attention resources there, they're just going to move on. So there's a really important concept called salience. So salience is something more present, or does it stick out compared to its competitors? If you Google this, you'll see, like, one of the Google images that comes up is a whole bunch of green apples, and there's one red apple. It's a bit obvious. The red apple is going to stick out. It's what you're going to see in your visual field. So salience comes from visual research, but we can apply it to things that are more than just visual. And the idea is that red apple sticks out. It's going to grab your attention. And with the attention economy, because salience and this idea of attention, we now have this attention economy, how you spend your attention. If your brand is not salient, if your product's not salient, you've already lost. Forget about emotion. I mean, emotion's important, definitely, but if you don't grab that initial attention, you can't take it further. You know, you're not gonna keep the person. So there are also principles there, and there are principles in the e-commerce space that one needs to be mindful of in holding attention, so that you can help the person to have a pleasant experience, a productive experience, efficient experience, but they're not going to get bored, their attention is not going to wander, they're not going to spend or move their perceptual resources elsewhere. There are various principles that we can use to do that. We have what are called direct visual principles, and these principles work on the basics of the visual system. So if you can zoom into the brain, it's often at the back of your brain, the occipital lobe. It has a number of, starts at the base of the, well, just above the base of the spine here. V1, which is visual cortex, sort of your basic visual system. You see things through your eyes. It kind of crosses and reaches the back of your brain, and you interpret color, orientation, shape, and size. Shape is a bit more complex. So you got to look at the way you use color on your website. If you have too much contrast or there's a color mismatch, you could lose a person. Now, this is very context dependent kind of stuff. There's no very hard and fast rules here. It really applies to the other visual features as well. You can't just look at color in isolation, and there's no exact rule that you can't have like a brown and a blue, or a it doesn't quite work like that, because they're shades and they're other components of mixing color together. But if that isn't right, you could lose someone. For example, if you have a call to action on your website and you want them to move there quite quickly, and the call to action color is not discriminative enough or differentiated enough, you may lose that person. But then you can look at things like shape. So we know that there are principles from the academic literature and research that indicate that certain call to action buttons or buttons on website can be more effective when they look a particular way. But that's also context dependent. You could have a button that looks like an arrow. It's more important, it drives them towards another feature of the website. We then, moving from these sort of basic visual principles, you get more complex, and as you kind of move up and then forward into the brain, we start identifying faces, we start identifying more complex shapes and images. We're quite interested in faces, although it can be overused. You've got to be quite careful whether you have a picture of a person. Our brain loves faces. It's wired to pick up a face, a thing that looks like two eyes and a mouth. That's often the first thing that someone will look at on a website, on actually any marketing material, any material in fact. If something looks like a face, even an animal face, it drives attention. So you've got to be careful. That can actually take away a lot of attention from maybe important or other important areas on your website. So you've got to look at it carefully. There are also principles of a face looking at the person versus looking at maybe an important area on the website or an important call to action. Again, context dependent. That can work for you. That can also backfire if you have the face looking at something. So there could be other components of the website that you're using that strategy, but it diminishes the rest of the effects that you want. Maybe there's a get hold of us button, or some important policy information or something they just skip because all their attention is just soaked up by this face, and then they just move on and they skip other important components. So it's carefully considering many of these principles. So that's just an overview of some of the visual design principle features that work on attention. So I've spoken to you a bit about emotion, memory, and attention. All three of those are important to get right first for decision making, driving a person to make a decision. If you haven't grabbed a person's attention, if you haven't elicited an emotional response, engaged the individual, they may not act on the experience. They may just move on, forget about it. So decision making is a very complex area in consumer psychology and neuroscience. It's difficult to button it down completely. We often use an approach that originally came from behavioral economics. It's also a heuristic, so think about it as just a simplified way of thinking about decision making, that you can split decision making into two types of decision making. We can't always find these exact things in the brain, so we're quite careful about using this theory, and it comes from Kahneman. He's a behavioral economist, wrote a very popular book called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. The principles are built on that. So thinking slow principle, we call it System 2, and that is considerate thinking, deliberate, using a lot of your resources, your attention, cognition, memory, deliberating on something, and then executing a behavior. The System 1 is this faster, quicker, intuitive, emotive way of making a decision. And we know that day-to-day people rely primarily on a system 1 because it's less energy intensive for the brain, and it's easier for people. In a e-commerce environment, system 1 primarily predominates. People have multiple tabs open, they already have diversified attention, they're searching very quickly, it's all about efficiency, so that's built into system 1. Even if the person is looking for financial information, they may draw a bit on system 2, they may have some considerations. Let's say they're looking for a insurance policy and they have some really big and important considerations. The elements of a website that are going to drive some of the initial decision making will be system 1, because they want to get there quickly and then maybe engage more thoroughly when they get to the point that they need to get to. If those initial system 1 drivers, those, they're not emotionally engaged, they're getting frustrated, it's going to impact their later experience. And we know that. There's some very good research that shows us that if you've lost someone, if you haven't engaged, again, the system 1, they start getting frustrated because they don't want to expend a lot of energy unless it's necessary at the point where it's necessary. The experience later on, when it's that necessary point to like, okay, now I'm going to read through, now I need to make this important decision. Am I going to buy this thing online? Am I going to click order? Because this is where a lot of people lose their customers. There's this fall off. They may load up their cart and they just don't click buy, or they just don't get there. They move on, or they look at another competitor, etc. There is good evidence that suggests frustration comes in the way. If the search is difficult, if there's also choice overload, so that's very difficult to get around. I mean, if they look for something on a website, let's say it's an e-commerce website, and there's a lot of choice, and the page is set up so they're just bombarded. It's not efficiently set up to move through choice in a system 1 way, because you can have a page where you have so much choice that you don't know which one, then the person's doing research, etc. That delay can affect that sort of whether the person will commit, make the decision, the purchase decision. We're living in the new normal. What is the new normal? And I think there's always sort of a shift towards, I mean, I don't know what normal would be, but there's a shift, there's a change in the people's mindsets worldwide. And as a psychologist, that's my background. We see this current global pandemic and situation we're in as an existential crisis. It has 2 existential components to it. So existential means that it gets us to really think about meaning, purpose, and it challenges us on a very deep level about what it means to be human, what it means to live in the societies we live in, what we do day to day. It's jarring and shaking. And the other 2 areas there are freedom. So a lot of governments have been called on to initiate various forms of lockdown, which have restricted people to assist with management of the pandemic. And when you reduce a person's freedom of movement, access, decision making, it's extremely stressful. Where a person in many societies has had, most societies, not all, but have had a level of freedom to make certain decisions and choices and go out and see people. So that in itself causes a major amount of stress, and we can see it. There are some preliminary studies, and I think in the next number of months here, from the more academic clinical psychology literature, we'll probably have a better understanding about the way this is affecting people all over the world emotionally. The other big fear is there's a virus and a lot of uncertainty about it. I suppose we're getting better information as the weeks roll by and the months roll by, and scientists are, they do more research, and that research is disseminated and better understood. But there's a lot of mixed information out there, which is very, very stressful for people. So all in all, people are generally more anxious. And it's not just this lockdown and the virus. I think this, on a global level, there's this economic worry. And we can see that the global economy has taken a turn. It's been wobbly for a while, and now it's really, people talk about contractions and potential recessions. And that's scary as well for a lot of people, because it's their security that's at risk. People have lost their jobs. So a huge amount of anxiety. And that will affect decision making and how people will shop, what they'll shop for, how they'll make those decisions. To take a step back before going into those behaviors, just to give you maybe an idea of what anxiety is. I spoke about emotions earlier. We gave an idea of the various kinds of emotions. Anxiety is an emotional state that will overrule other emotional states, because it's about survival. If I feel happy, if I feel annoyed, sad, anxiety I'll feel that more than I will feel the others. The reason for that is that it's not that different from fear. Anxiety is what we call preemptive fear, future fear. Fear, you're worried right now. You're fearful about something happening right now. Anxiety is like a what if. What if, oh sure, things don't go well in a year. What if I don't know, are things going to change in the next 2 months? We're kind of concerned about things that could happen to us. And if you don't deal with threat, so if you go back to fear, you could get harmed. So we haven't always lived in cities. We lived in totally different environments, not such concentrated communities of 1 million plus people. Let's say little tribal communities, and if you're walking around on the savannah there, or in the sort of jungle, and the grass is shaking, and you look at the grass and you don't know what is there, it's better for you to think there's something dangerous rather than not, even if what comes through the grass is one of your friends or someone from the tribe. We've actually evolved to make what we call a type 1 error. Think there's something wrong and then correct it. That's anxiety. So you're preempting threat because it keeps you alive. We live in cities now. We don't live in these sort of communities, but that's continued. We have a brain that's pretty ancient and old, and it's a strong driver. So that's just an idea of how it drives decision making. If I'm more anxious, I'm more prone to making heuristic decisions, maybe type 1 error decisions. We know as psychologists that there is at times a narrowing of cognition and resources, working memory and attention when a person's anxious. What that means for business is that people will rely on what they know more. They probably less likely to take risks, try out new things. They also are likely to rely on more patterned habitual behavior, which means that when they go shop, when they go online and they're looking for things, they're less likely to kind of seek out a new experience and opportunity. It's not always the case. This is a generalization, but we see this operating under situations of anxiety and fear. So I think brands need to be sensitive to people's anxiety at this time, and there's a number of things you can do to assist your customers. We wouldn't suggest you directly talk about how you're mindful and care directly about how they feel that they're struggling with their existential difficulties or that they're anxious, because that could come across in a disingenuous way. But you still want to appeal and be empathic, and I think that is through your actions as a provider, as an e-commerce platform. I think what people want now is consistency, warmth. You know, if they're struggling with something, that there is someone on the other side, you know, they can get help, because there's a sense of isolation and frustration. You can't just go to the shop and see someone face to face and communicate. And I think that demonstrates a sympathy and an empathy to people's anxieties and frustrations at this point. There are also principles one can be aware of. These are sort of design principles and considerations for the actual mechanics and user interface, user experience processes. So we're looking into some principles such as just making it easier for people to find the products and essentials that they want, that they have to spend less time doing that. A lot of customers don't feel they have control of a lot of decisions because there is that restriction of freedom. And I think giving your customer a sense of control, options, not too many options because you don't want choice overload, but a sense of control around how they want to pay for a product or how they make their purchase decision. Another really valuable principle that can be applied is a returns policy, and that there's efficiency around there. A person can potentially track that process, or they have a sense of when that will happen, and it's laid out for them. So it's not just all up in the air. They don't know when, you know, the product will arrive back or whether they'll get their product. So I think being clear. So it's not just on returns, it's also on tracking and giving people a sense of certainty where there is none in that buying behavior is a great way to assist if people are already quite anxious, already worried about spending money. It makes the purchase dissonance less. So purchase dissonance is the sense of spending money that I'm worried about for a product, and I know that I'm going to get the product, that sense of getting it, and that transaction is more consolidated. They feel more comfortable about that process. So create certainties, create transparency, make the process easier for your customer.
Thank you for both your time and your attention today. We'd like to leave you with some final thoughts around some neuromarketing principles and how they can help you and your business. The use of color. The use of color should be used beyond just the aesthetic, but rather be used as a strategic asset across your website or online platform. Color accents can aid navigation, accessibility, legibility, and drive the desired user behavior, as well as aid psychological effects to an extent. Visual cues and iconography. The use of visual cues, iconography, to represent features, functionality, or content can nudge user behavior. Whereas visual cues provide clues about how a user should use an app or website, icons go just a little bit further and actually communicate ideas using a metaphorical association. All must have a shared thematic style, consistent design elements, and possibly include a label if somewhat unfamiliar or ambiguous. Visual hierarchy. Visual hierarchy guides people towards content or actions of importance, and can also show relationships between different bits of content. It determines the order in which people take in and process information. Intuitive user interface. Is your user interface clean, unobtrusive, and not busy? Are responses obvious and there when you expect them to be? Is the user interface organized and laid out well? And is there excessive functionality? Remember, try and refrain from information overload. Consistency. Is there consistency across your layout, placement, visuals and terminology, and also your naming conventions? Menus and buttons should all be laid out consistently across all aspects of your platform. Usefulness. When testing a user interface feature, ask if the feature you see actually contributes to the software's value. Many apps and websites have useless features that only clutter and make the experience less optimal. User control. Always provide the user with as much control as possible during every process or function. There should be undo, back, and search buttons, as well as keyboard shortcuts. These are a great way to give a user control over a website or an application. Language and naming conventions. Language should be clear and simple, using user language, not corporate or product language. There should be consistency in the tone and manner, and also the amount of information presented should also be consistent.